Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Welcome back to me, Phil Craig, the Australian Bar Scandal Mongers podcast. Yes, we've been here before, quite a few times now. Although rather fewer of you joined me last week, I have to say that I'd expected. I get to look at the analysis. Since I kind of took the podcast over myself, I can see behind the curtain all of the data that YouTube collects about channels like this. And you can see things like click-through rate and browsing ratios and all sorts of stuff. I don't fully understand all of it, if I'm honest. But I could see that a normal number of people checked out the show, a smaller number of people than normal clicked through to watch it. And I think that's partly the title. Theo, my producer, said you shouldn't really talk about death in a title of a show. I think it slightly throws the algorithm off as well. I think you get less prominence, and I think also it just puts people off. And I have to say, it was a grim subject. If you haven't seen last week's show, actually, it is one of the more interesting ones I've done. I mean, Quentin takes you through. Quentin McDermott, my friend, was talking about Catherine Folbig and the story of how she was convicted of murdering her 4 children, and it was pretty clear that that case should never have come to court, and she suffered 20 years in prison. Yeah, a tough watch. And several of you, I'm not going to name you, several of you in the comments revealed your own experiences with illness with children and the death of children, and it's clearly an incredibly sensitive and difficult area. I thought Quentin handled it brilliantly, and it is an incredible story for in journalism, miscarriages of justice, how the legal system works, and also I think how attitudes to women still sometimes can determine the reaction of courts and reporters and even judges. I would recommend it, even if it does seem like a grim subject. Some lovely comments from those of you who did click through. Chris H, 2277. Yes, as mentioned by Quentin, Chris says, a definite correlation here between Kathleen Folbig and Lindy Chamberlain. Remember the famous dingo baby case? The legal system doesn't seem to handle mothers very well if they don't fit a stereotype. Very true. That's very much a factor in this. Lovely message from Carolyn McGovern, 8059. I think I've seen you on here before, Carolyn. Thank you for sticking with me. Really enjoyed the show. We need quality, reasoned and intelligent debate more than ever. I desperately miss programs like Rough Justice and World in Action. Now, Quentin and I both started our careers on World in Action back in the 80s. That was a very famous British current affairs show. I miss the days when there was a middle ground and people could disagree passionately yet be civil to people as well. Yeah, well, we've talked about this a lot, and I very much miss those days as well. And I try to recreate a little bit of that mood here on my own tiny corner of the internet. Anyway, turning to other matters, JM162, congratulations for saving Shark Week, Phil. Yeah, live every week like it's Shark Week. I used to have a T-shirt with that on. I think that's from, I don't know, was it Community, that American comedy series? Anyway, great quote. And yes, there was my amusing Shark Week anecdote. I think I can say it was amusing. Quite a few of you commented on Twitter as well that you found it fun to hear about my adventures with Richard Dreyfuss and a helicopter and the launch of Shark Week in front of a rather impatient TV mogul, Mr. David Zaslav. Yes. I want to talk about royals. I haven't mentioned the program, have I? I'll get to that. You know what it's about. It's about seduction. Now, that hopefully is a more seductive title than last week's title. And we'll come to that soon. And the story, well, it's a story, the history of the world, really. But it's quite a literate episode, this, I think. The story we're going to tell later in the show, it's about changing society and sort of both legal and philosophical ideas about romance and about relationships. So I think there's quite a lot to dig into in the interview that's coming up. But I wanted first to talk a bit more about the royals. It's been a hell of a week for the royals, and I think a very significant week, in an unexpected way for William. Before I get to William, it was very interesting yesterday. I'm recording this on Friday, the 28th of Feb. Keir Starmer had what was supposed to be a very difficult first meeting in the White House with Trump. Well, first meeting with him as president. And he went in there with a letter and surprised Trump with this letter from King Charles. And you could see from Trump's face that this was not rehearsed. He was genuinely thrilled. And you think, the power of the royal brand, it's still there, isn't it? Here he is negotiating these very difficult conversations about trade, Ukraine, free speech. There's been a lot of bad blood in recent weeks, and Trump and Vance have said some things that have really offended Europeans, and others have said, well, Europeans need to listen on things like defense spending and so on and so forth. But totally disarmed Trump. You could see the joy on his face. He was going to get a second state visit, official royal visit, state visit, hosted by the royals. This has never happened before, twice to a president, I don't think. And of course, Trump loves nothing more than feeling important. To get a hand-delivered letter from Charles, Keir Starmer's going all in. Let's play the Trump card to Trump. He'll ride in carriages. He'll go to Scotland. He'll hang out with the royals. He will be the focus of attention, which of course he loves. It's good for his ego, and probably good. He and his spin doctors will think it's good for the voters in America to see him like that, as an important man hanging out with famous royals. And you think, well, yeah, Macron is a president. He's a head of state. There's pomp and circumstance in France as well, but it's not the same, is it? Because the royals are apolitical. Whatever their private feelings, and now and again you get suggestions that perhaps the Queen wasn't as fond of Trump as he said she was. But, these are private feelings. In public, they're apolitical. They represent the country, whatever party's in government. And they come with a backstory and heritage and a sense of grandeur and importance of the state and of historic ties, for example, between Britain and America. I mean, we in Britain, we love to talk about the special relationship. I'm not sure Americans talk about it as much, to be honest. Maybe we flatter ourselves that we're so special. But anyway, there's something there. There's some magic there that is above politics. So that's one argument why this old ex-Republican can accept now that the monarchy has a role to play. And William, I'm talking of William. William has already made it clear that he wants to be close to the Trump presidency. Apparently, there's talk about him doing a big visit to America with Catherine, which would be another, thing that Trump would very much enjoy being part of. I'm sure he'll do much more than just see politicians. But again, it's very good for relations that have been strained at a time of great jeopardy and drama. And a lot of us my side of the Atlantic, we're very worried about Ukraine. And we hope that Trump might walk back some of his comments he's made about Zelensky being a dictator and Ukraine being sort of responsible for the war. And there was a suggestion yesterday that actually he has a little bit. I think we see with Trump sometimes he makes the big statement, the big claim, and then he slightly pulls back. Maybe that's part of the art of the deal that he's so famous for. I don't know. But anyway, I think William, if he does go to America, will also contribute to knocking the rough edges, shall we say, of this new, rather abrasive president. So yeah, the roles are important. But the really big thing this week, I think, was the interview in Australia on 60 Minutes on Channel 9 with Jason Knauf. Some of you will have seen it or heard about it. I think it's one of the most significant things we've seen from the royals for some time. Really quite important. This man does not give interviews. He might have given short ones before, I don't know. This was the first proper considered sit-down interview with him, where he really did get into some of the big issues of the last few years, particularly between William and Harry. And it was fascinating. And I know a little bit about how these interviews happen. My work on Diana, in a sense, was all about pulling apart some of the big media appearances that defined her life and Charles's life during the marriage. The Andrew Morton book, the Dimbleby book, the Martin Bashir interview. None of these things happen by accident. There's an awful lot of negotiation and positioning and deal making behind the scenes. And I thought it's actually rather significant that this was done by 60 Minutes in Australia. I am not dissing 60 Minutes in Australia. I know because I've worked in Australia myself. It does some very tough journalism. And it did indeed in this show raise all of the hard questions that you'd expect it to raise. But it didn't really grill Jason on them. And I suspect there was a certain amount of pre-negotiation. And maybe 60 Minutes in Australia would be more open to that kind of a deal than some other media I could think of. Like I say, not questioning their journalism. It was an amazing scoop. But I just think it's maybe insignificant that they went there and not say to the BBC or to the British version of a 60 Minutes, or indeed an American one. It was perhaps just a little bit more controllable, plannable. And what was negotiated, I wonder? Well, it's so interesting. Jason, as many of you will know, was an absolute key player in the story that we've talked about when it first broke, actually, on this podcast 2.5 years ago when we started. Valentine Lowe, his work on bullying and Meghan and allegations that she was very difficult to her, very difficult to work with, and drove people to the brink and made people leave royal service, and that there was an inquiry which Jason ran. We've never seen the result of that. We probably never will. But certain emails were leaked. Were they leaked intentionally? I think they probably were. And this was all at the time when the row was at its hottest, and the Oprah Winfrey interview and the suggestion that the royals had been racially prejudiced against Meghan, speculating on the colour of her child, which is the single most damaging thing in all of this to the British royal family. And all of this came out, and Jason was a big part of it. So to get him in front of the camera to talk about all of this stuff is quite a coup. He came across as a nice man, consummate professional, but warm. He came across as understanding, slightly objective. You know, he's worked with Harry and Meghan before he worked with William and Kate. And by the way, he still does work kind of slightly secondhand on the Earthshot project for William and Kate. So there's no way this happens without William and Kate knowing about it and approving of it, I think, in every detail. William and Kate and their media people will have known and planned and strategized this entire program. I think, whether or not 60 Minutes sat around the table with them and said, this is what we're going to do and what we're going to do, they probably didn't. But there are coded ways that messages can be sent. And our understanding is this will happen and that will happen and so on. And if you want us again, you won't break that understanding. This is how these things work. He wasn't asked directly at all about some of the really hard things, which I'm sure was pre-planned. He wasn't asked about the racism allegations. He wasn't actually asked what it was like working for Harry and Meghan at all, even though he has done himself. But the show raises it. It had to, and it did. And it raised it by having some other contributors and some little archive sequences. And so it mentioned bullying. It mentioned that he'd done this report. So what did he really say? Well, he spoke about the wedding, Harry and Meghan's wedding. It was magical, he said. Well, it was. And in those days, the Fab Four, as they were, seemed to be taking the royal brand in an exciting new direction. And he talked about how he thought that they did lots of good work then. So I thought that's quite significant, that somebody, kind of as a spokesperson for William, which is what he really is now, I think, in the context of this interview, chose to say there were good things that happened, even though we all know about the row. He talked about the ups and downs that we have with people that we love, people in a family. Interesting as well, isn't it, that was highlighted in this program, that he really wanted to say that. Kind of understanding, like I say, objective, but all pre-negotiated. All of it will have been pre-approved by William himself, inevitably. And then there was another interviewee who hasn't attracted very much attention in the commentary I've seen on this program. But I thought this was also really significant. And again, it will have been everybody will have known who was in the show and what they were going to say before Jason sat down to be interviewed. And that was somebody who doesn't appear very often, Grant Harold, royal butler. Why was he chosen, I wonder? Well, maybe it's because he said this. He said that at the coronation, he was pretty sure, and we don't know when the coronation of William will be, of course, but we know Charles is fairly elderly and he's not been well. So why was this in the programme? Well, there must be a reason. At the coronation, Grant Harold said he was pretty sure that Harry would be there, would be welcome there. That's an invitation. That is a public gesture from William to Harry, delivered through a third party. And the fact that it's in a show where Jason, who is William's kind of closest media representative for a long time and friend, for him to say that in a show that Jason is in as well, that's really important, I think. And I do speak sometimes, and I know a lot of you don't want to hear this, but I do speak sometimes about reconciliation being in the air. A roadmap is being put together. These words, these suggestions, whether it's the Invictus Games or the coronation, the argument will be, yes, in hot blood, we said things. We went too far. Family is family. You always hurt the ones you love, but they're your family. And you do find your way back to them. I mean, not everybody in every walk of life. But that's the message that's been sent, I think. That, yes, it was bad. I know, me, Jason, know how bad it was because I was in the weeds of some of the nastier allegations. But they did good work together. They are family. You say things sometimes you don't mean when you're angry. You go too far. You exaggerate. But there are some big things. One of the big things is he's going to be king. Maybe in a few years. Will Harry be there? I bet he will. And this whole programme actually was part of what's been a very successful relaunch, I think, of William and Kate, Catherine, in recent months. They did their first joint appearance in Wales for some time. This week as well, big success. The body language was terrific. William had not looked as good or as happy for some time. And in fact, in the interview, Jason said, and this was something else they clearly wanted to put out there, that during the cancer diagnosis and Kate's treatment, it was the saddest, the most stressed that he'd ever seen William. And that would have been, he didn't say that without approval. So they've come through that. They've got a spring in their step. They're returning to joint public duties. People are coming out and cheering them. They look happy. And now, from a position of strength, and I think Harry and Meghan are in a little bit of a position of weakness now, given the way their media career has gone. From a position of strength, they are sending out little signals, rather big signals, in my opinion. So I think I said a couple of weeks ago that you can call me out on this, that when the Invictus Games comes to Birmingham in England in 2027, there will be an image of the two brothers side by side in the stadium. Bookmark this, I could be wrong. It might happen sooner if it's a coronation. But there's a path is being laid, to walk back, perhaps in a similar way that Trump walked back some of his more extreme statements this week, perhaps charmed by a letter from the king. Well, I think there's a path being laid to walk back. It doesn't have to be a public apology. Words can be found to say we're moving on. We know that things got heated. We're moving on. I don't think this programme on 60 Minutes happens without that being the message that William and his people want to send. It's time to move on. Don't know whether you agree. You might agree. You might not. Anyway, I'm just going to remind myself of the title of this book because I did the interview 3 weeks ago, and even though Clement said it's not called Seduction at all, silly Phil, Strange Antics, that's it. Yes, it's about seduction. And Clement Knox, who is the writer, spoke to me, I think about 3 weeks ago about it. We'll go to him in a minute. But yeah, it's actually called Strange Antics. That's it, which I hope you enjoy. So basically, long story short, the history of the world told through sex and seduction, and great works of literature, and how the balance of power, I think, between men and women has changed over the years, and with that, so has the idea of how one negotiates a relationship. So I hope you found that interesting. I certainly did talking to him. We're back at the end of this with more thoughts from the bar. Until then, thanks for watching. Bye for now. Clement, thank you so much for joining me. And thank you for sharing the PDF. I didn't have time to get hold of a copy of the book. So you shared me the PDF of your proofs, which, apart from being a really good read, Also, I found quite reassuring because I now I'm not the only author who makes schoolboy mistakes of spelling and has a passive aggressive relationship with a copy editor.
You know what? I think I basically had a big folder for this book, which I'm sure all authors do. And it got so big that my computer couldn't handle it anymore. So I had to put it on an external hard drive, which I've now lost. So
Oh God.
I couldn't find the finished PDF. And I thought because there wasn't much time left, I'd rather just send you what I had rather than work my way through my publisher. So
Oh,
yeah, you've probably seen more than you should have, but
that was very. I found your comments to your designer quite entertaining. Because I've been doing my own at the moment on my own book. Anyway, yeah, what a big, ambitious, clever book, and such an original way to take us through the story of society and literature and art. But at some point, I think you say this is about power, desire, race, class, agency, and the law. I thought, well, I like all those things.
yeah.
What made you want to write it?
Um, it's funny because obviously I published this book it'll be 5 years ago on Thursday. And I was 27 when I think I got the book deal. So all of which says this is quite a long time ago now, it feels like. And what I would say is that obviously like this kind of subject feels a lot more pressing in your 20s than it does in your 30s, because this is something everyone's going through, right? This is like a practical factor in your life, which is like you need to find husband, wife, other. You need to kind of like navigate that world, and obviously 2010s, millennials, like all of this stuff was very uh, widely spoken about, and the actual terms on which courtship and romance were taking place had changed a lot, not just in terms of like the cultural conversation, although as we all remember that was pretty fraught, but just technology as well. And
Well,
so
I think you say also that during the course of you writing the book, the Harvey Weinstein story broke, the Me Too
yeah,
movement happened, internet dating, which was already a big thing, just completely took over.
yeah,
When we just do not meet people in any way like we used to. I mean, you're
no,
about the age of my children.
yeah,
Well, I know my daughter met her husband on a dating site, and it's like all of her friends. That's how they meet their partners now.
yeah.
But we should
So
go
yeah,
back. We should go back to the beginning because there's so many lovely, colourful stories that you choose to kind of develop your various theories about seduction and the place it plays and has played in our history. And you start actually by saying that our modern idea of seduction really only came about because of the Enlightenment, and before that, yes, there were stories in the Bible and there were stories in Greek mythology, but the power relationships were so completely different. And I think
yeah,
you say something like it's only when women were more expected to or allowed to choose their partners and maybe also have property and wealth that was worth getting that the idea of seduction became so kind of important.
yeah. There's a great book called "The Origins of Sex: The Inventions of Sex" by Faramarz Daboiwala, who's a um, history professor at Oxford, and he describes how basically in the 17th century in England, you went from this quite amazingly strict and puritanical, literally puritanical approach to sexual policing, where Oliver Cromwell's brother at one point was sent as like a traveling judge to the southwest, and he was literally sentencing women to be burned alive for adultery. And this is in the 1660s. And then by the end of the century, the idea that you would do that had become completely barbaric and alien. And one of the kind of subplots of the kind of English Enlightenment was this belief that if you that people had independent moral agency. And the most famous example of that was religious tolerance, like the idea that people should be allowed to be a Quaker or be a Methodist. And the Anglican position was that obviously they're going to go to hell, right? It's not going to end up well for them, but we are going to afford them that liberty, and that logic actually permeated every level of society, and it included sex and marriage. And by the early decades of the 18th century, it was widely understood, even by conservatives like Samuel Richardson, the novelist who I discussed, that women should be allowed to choose their own husbands, which seems like quite small beer to us. but it was a very big change and quite radical, especially compared to countries like Italy, where there was still huge amounts of parental involvement in those kind of choices. And so once you get from punishing sexuality to kind of tolerating it or celebrating it in some form, immediately you have a whole set of problems that didn't exist before. Because beforehand, if a woman was seduced, you could more or less just throw the baby out with the bathwater and be like, well, you're an evil, sinful woman, you can get punished. But now it was like, well, we actually value liberty and we do think you should have choice. And men are now also culpable because you can't lead someone up the garden path and then abandon them as a ruined woman. And so these seduction narratives all of a sudden become very widespread because it's an actual live issue in society. You're not just ignoring it. You're saying, well, I want my daughter to choose the right man to marry. And if that process of choice goes wrong, then we've got an issue that we need to talk about. And at the same time, the novel comes into existence. And the novel is a great kind of liberal kind of medium of communication, because it dramatizes that psychological drama of, will she, won't she? What's the impact of someone's kind of imprecations or kind of insinuations? How do you respond to the external forces operating on your agency? And that's
that's Laura Thompson, the writer. I don't know if you know her work. She wrote a book on heiresses a few years ago. She was talking to me on the podcast recently about just this thing, the explosion of books about elopements and deceived women and women who are seduced, married, and then stuck away in some terrible asylum, and their property is taken from them. And it was just the dominant theme of so much of the culture of that time, as you say. But you also take us, you mentioned Richardson, you take us into his world through this extraordinary character. I'd love you to talk about this guy, Francis Charteris. I mean, I don't want to say extraordinary, it sounds admirable. He was obviously a complete swine. The most popular whoremaster in the Three Kingdoms, I think you quote somebody saying, who lured many women into his toils as would set up a sultan.
Yeah.
One poor woman had to kind of pull a gun on him to escape. But tell us about him and how his trial became such a big deal.
Well, Charteris was just a kind of classic product of the sort of late Stuart aristocracy. He had a lot of money from Scotland, a lot of money, and he came down to London. And he was a former army veteran, and he was just an all-round bad man, card cheat, swindler. By modern standards, we would just call him a rapist, right? There was no kind of there was not much of elegance in what he was doing. He was just exploiting women. Often these women were people who either were prostitutes or were female servants in his house, which again is a very important kind of subplot to all of this, like the problem of female servitude and labor, which again is what Me Too was about as well, right? About the workplace. And Charteris, basically it all just went too far and he ended up being sort of driven out of town. But he was so infamous that he actually features in Hogarth's The Rake's Progress. He is in the the Harlot's Progress, the kind of female version of The Rake's Progress. He is in the background of the first plate of that as this young woman gets out of the carriage in London. And so he became this kind of the epitome of the kind of rake and of the bad man who's waiting for you in the city, or indeed in your in domestic service, if you kind of if you're a young woman and you strayed into his world. And that was kind of it's a good launching point for the whole book, because there are so many contemporary echoes to that, but also that figure stays with you all the way through literature, in Jane Austen, in Dracula, all over the place. And I'll tell you a funny story. Like after the book, so Charteris's heirs are still going. They're still, I think it's the...
We should just say he was actually condemned to death, but managed to get away with it, didn't he?
Yeah, I think back then you could actually just bribe your way out. I think it was not... that was like, if you were an earl, then that was very, very much the norm. And anyways, the Earls of Wemyss are still going. And a guy I know said that some of them had got in touch with him after the book came out, said they wanted to defend the record of their ancestor, who apparently in their world was a great guy. So yeah.
Well, no, he's an amazing character. I mean, a complete swine, as we said. But he gets into a court of law, sentence of death. Apparently, the crowds are cheering. He's not very popular as they take him away. But then somebody bribes somebody or has a word with somebody, and I think he gets a royal pardon, doesn't he? Something like that.
I think he literally just paid enough money to the king. That was fine those days. It's worth noting as well, because you mentioned the crowds were cheering, and in the book, when he gets buried in Edinburgh, they throw things at his grave as the coffin's going down, and they threw live cats and live dogs. They were pelting the funeral cortege with live animals, which is amazing imagery. But it's interesting as well that there's a class dimension to all this, which is that often seduction narratives have a kind of equalizing dimension, because it's like, just because you're an earl and you're rich, you can't get away with violating the virtue of a servant girl or a kind of working class woman. There is a kind of way that you kind of even the scales by referring to morality versus power. And again, that stays with us to this day. It's very it's quite a subversive trope because it's very effective.
Well, actually, we're jumping ahead a little bit now, but isn't it the case that when Wilkie Collins wrote his books, The Woman in White, isn't it, where there's this terrible injustice done to this woman who was locked away in an asylum? That book and other books of its type really did change the law. I mean, people said, we've got to do something about this. We just cannot let people be exploited in this way. But I was very keen to talk about Shelley, Mary Shelley, because I think the way you tell her story is so interesting. And you present her book, Frankenstein, famously, and the monster in Frankenstein in a way I'd never thought about it before. So do tell me a little bit about how you see her fitting into this story and why you think the monster means something to do with, well, illegitimate children, effectively. But go on.
Sure. Well, what I thought, I mean, this is the kind of thing which you really think everyone should know, and then you find out when you start researching that how little you know about all of this stuff, which is that Mary Shelley didn't come from anywhere. She didn't come from obscurity. She was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a kind of, in some ways, the first English feminist intellectual. You could argue about that, but it's pretty good place to start with that tradition in our country. And her father was William Godwin, who was, again, now not very well known, but at the time was probably one of the most notorious radical philosophers of his time. And obviously his time was the time of the French Revolution. Again, we don't take the French Revolution very seriously anymore as a kind of culture war issue, if you like. But back then, that was like the culture war to end all culture wars.
Absolutely.
And you had English radicals moving to France at the height of the terror to endorse the French Revolutionary Project. And Mary Wollstonecraft went. William Godwin, I actually can't recall now if he went or not, but he was definitely grouped in by Gilray and all the other Rowlandson, all the satirists who were all conservatives with that. And Mary Shelley came out of this radical philosophical ferment. And so I thought that was a really interesting starting point, because a lot of Mary Wollstonecraft's writings were about sex and power imbalances and seduction. She talked about seduction law in Maria, the last book she wrote. So she was really concerned with that. And Wollstonecraft herself had been jilted by a man called Gilbert Imlay, who was an American she had met in Paris. And she ended up having an illegitimate child by him. She tried to kill herself in the Thames, and I don't know how she survived. She was pulled out of the river. Quite amazing she survived that. And then she had married Godwin, and had always suffered with the stigma of that kind of...
So Godwin marries her knowing that she has this illegitimate daughter, Claire, isn't it?
Exactly.
Claire becomes Mary Shelley's half-sister.
Exactly. Which is...
And friend.
Exactly. And Godwin's is an amazing guy, because he's so radical. He doesn't care about this stuff, which is quite admirable. But he also has all these wacky ideas. Like, he wrote a book where he looked forward to a future where we could abolish sleep and everyone would be awake the entire time and we could get more done, I guess. So he's really far out there even by modern standards. But on that kind of issue, he was a stand-up, decent man, and he cared for her child, and he cared for the child they had together, Mary. And Mary ends up falling in with Percy Shelley quite young. Percy kind of hero worship her father, because he was kind of a radical of the older generation. And those two, by the time they're sort of 18, are sort of together, Mary and Percy. And then her sister Claire, half-sister Claire, becomes obsessed with George Byron, who's the most famous poet of the day. And again, something of a Chartist figure. He's not as bad, but he's in that kind of...
He's rake adjacent. shall we say.
Regular Jason. Yeah, yes, that's a good way of putting it. They end up, as everyone kind of knows this part of the story, they all end up going to Switzerland together, and they're by Lac Le Mans, and Byron's being terribly poorly behaved towards Claire because and bear in mind, all of these people are under the age of 23 at this point.
Incredible.
They're all children, really. And Claire, I think, is 16. Byron's in his early 20s.
And doesn't she have a child by Byron?
Yes. So he is making sort of midnight visits to her room in the night, and then being very mean to her in the daytime. And then she gets pregnant, and then there's the year without summer. It's raining. They all stay inside, and they write the horror stories. And this is where Frankenstein comes from. It's also where Polidori's The Vampire comes from, which is Polidori was Byron's surgeon, like private doctor, who was also exceptionally poorly treated by Byron on this holiday, and left a very, very funny account of like basically how mean Byron was to him. And anyway, we're getting sidetracked. Basically, as you can tell, there are so many subplots and like circles within circles of all of this stuff, which is why it's fascinating. But Frankenstein is about, a crazy scientist who makes a human life from nothing. And this insight into kind of its meaning is not necessarily mine. There was a book published in the 1970s called The Mad Woman in the Attic, which was kind of like a really pioneering kind of feminist work of literary criticism. I can't remember what the author is, but you can look her up. And she made the point that, this is about the failure of male responsibility to women in this kind of like sexual context. And a lot of the drama of Frankenstein is basically of the monster hounding Dr. Frankenstein. He literally chases him around the world. And in his encounters, he always talks to Dr. Frankenstein as if he's talking to a father. And so it's a father and son story, but the father's kind of like absconded, right? And at one point in the book, the monster says to Frankenstein, referring to his own creation, "How dare you thus sport with life?" As in, he's been flippant with creating life and has not lived up to his responsibilities. And I think it's not much of a leap to see that as being, Claire Claremont's bastard child talking to Byron. Byron has sported with life and then kind of fled the scene. And obviously, given the details of Mary's life, that's kind of what happened with her mother and Imlay. And it happened all over the place in 18th century and early 19th century Britain because there wasn't any contraception. So if you start messing around, you're going to have a lot of children.
Interesting. The abandoned product of male irresponsible, predatory, seducting power.
Yeah, and as we know, that was, I don't know if you followed the those kind of the laundries in Ireland. I don't know why they're called laundries.
Well, the Magdalen laundries, yes, terrible. I mean, we're still going into the 70s. Extraordinary.
Yeah, exactly. So that stigma and that kind of problem that like phenomenon did linger for a very long time. Again, it's quite hard for us to get into that mindset because the problem bastardy is not something that really we understand anymore, I don't think. But back then, it really was the be all and end all. And besides that, just because of the state of the medicine, there were all kinds of health problems as well as social stigma and everything else. So it was a big deal, and I think Frankenstein is kind of a parable about that.
I'm going to rush ahead because I only have another 10, 15 minutes with you, but your book's full of amazing stories. Bringing it more up to date, the 60s, sexual revolution, women's labour, the pill, obviously the whole dynamics of seduction changed dramatically. But what's really interesting to me is the pushback against that. Second wave feminists, I don't know what correct wave is, but a lot of people saying, actually, do you know what, guys? We need controls. We need a bit of shame. We need a bit of some limits on predatory men. And actually, I think when Weinstein tried to defend his behaviour, and I think you may mention this at the end of your book, Weinstein got up in court and said, well, actually, I was raised in the 60s, and this is just how men behaved.
Yeah.
Free love, let it all hang out, promiscuous society. Well, no. So something quite substantial happened between the 60s and the sort of end of the 90s. What do you think that was?
Well, I think people like new things. And when there's like just a wave, it was basically, it's weird to think of it in these terms, but I think it's probably just a what would be now geekily called like a cascade preference. Suddenly, what was once unthinkable became normal, and that was very exciting and very attractive. And it suddenly became very hard to make the old-fashioned argument with a straight face, which is that things could go wrong. Instead, it was all like people who are trying to like put a brake on the train are fusty conservatives, and the like free love and all the rest of it is like how things are going to be now forever. And in the moment, it's very hard to argue with that, because suddenly that's what everyone thinks. It's interesting, like what happens after that. Obviously, the AIDS crisis happens in the 70s and 80s, which really does end up kind of from a more kind of objective medical position, making people reevaluate stuff. 80s and 90s, you have a lot more concern about like teenage pregnancy and sexual STIs, basically. Again, that's kind of downstream of that. I don't know, but it came out, I think, since my book, but Louise Perry's book on the sexual revolution and kind of a reevaluation of like what that all meant. I think it just took time for all that to filter out. But Weinstein was being honest. That's completely accurate. And when you watch some of the films from the 60s and 70s, which kind of celebrated that era, and read the books, I reread some of this stuff for like my research, and it's pretty amazing. Like I read it. There's a great, well, I say great, the Oliver Stone book about the Doors. Yeah, it's called The Doors, and it's based on a book which was published in the late 60s about Jim Morrison. You reread that book, and like the things that Jim Morrison was getting up to, which journalists were just openly reporting on and not even criticizing. They thought it was like quite cool and far out, and how transgressive he was. And now as you read it, it's like that guy would go to jail.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of those rock stars would.
Exactly. And that's the other side of the 60s and 70s, which I think has never really been properly reported on. And I would love to read someone who would go deep into it, was you ended up with huge numbers of children running away from home, running away to San Francisco, to these communes in the Northwest. About 500,000 people were living in communes by the beginning of the 70s. And you ended up with an epidemic of child prostitution and child exploitation, which was never really properly examined. Sometimes in certain films like Taxi Driver, you get like a hint at it, but there was something really dark going on by that. Joan Didion kind of talks about this a bit as well in Slouching Towards Bethlehem. So yeah, there was a lot of dark stuff unleashed in that era.
I mean, I talked to Dan Davis, who wrote In Plain Sight about Jimmy Savile, and the account of Savile's in his own autobiography, which was out there, talking about how in the 60s, when he was a DJ, girls would come, broken homes, runaways from children's homes, and so on, and they would just, quotes, have fun with them and then eventually hand them back to the police.
Yeah.
And that was just, the police would say, okay, fine, I'll take them. And there's a sort of echo of the grooming gang story and all of that. But what I love is the book actually is about pendulums swinging back and forth. Because you say, everybody was rightly outraged about Weinstein and Savile. And then suddenly you get stories like that comedian, was it Ansari, who gets into all sorts of trouble because he's a date. Which is, I guess, the sort of a failed seduction, you could say, but a bad date, and his date ended up in tears in her Uber, famously. That isn't the same as Weinstein. Can't be, and we can't. I don't think we should live in, and you don't think we should live in a world where that sort of just impolite misreading of signals should be criminalized in the way Weinstein. But who draws the balance and weighs it all up is a big question.
Yep. And I think the fact that the pendulum swings so much is because at root, there are two conflicting impulses. One is that romance is all about passion and confusion. It's uncertain and scary and exciting. And the other side of it is very rational and kind of like, you can understand exactly what you want. And, it's all about consent and very kind of easily black and white. And because it's both of those things at once, both in terms of what's happening inside the individual, but also what's happening outside in the law and in society and in the media, you end up having this kind of like whipsawing between the two, where in the 70s, 60s, it was like, it's all groovy, right? You have needs, I have needs, we can all just like figure it out. It's going to be like very easy. We don't need to worry about like all these old fashioned constraints. And then suddenly you get to the point in 2018 where in fact, people were openly talking about trying to, a woman should never be alone in a room with a man again, right? Because that was the Pence rule, right? And people kind of mocked it. And years later were like, actually, maybe that's right, because we can't trust men to be around women in any environment without, abusive, exploitative practices happening. So I think every generation is going to experience this kind of like tension because it's unresolved and probably unresolvable.
I mean, as a 30-something guy, can you think of any of the other eras you've written about where you'd rather be alive than this one in terms of, the dating market, the marriage market? Just your life, as wouldn't it have been great to be in the 80s or the 60s or the 18th century?
I love like 1990s and 1980s rom-coms, and those that looks like a pretty healthy era, like pre-mobile phone, but you're still living in a world with like penicillin and and like New York, London were booming. Yeah, I mean like there's a whole chapter from the book about Casanova, and obviously I talk a lot about Georgian London. And if you could put me in a time machine and promise me I would come back, I would love to live a couple of months in those environments, just because they were so picturesque and so much going on. But no, I don't think I would like to live a full lifetime in those, if only for the disease and hygiene situations.
Well, there is that. You also very interesting at the end. You actually managed to, having, I guess, towards the end of writing a book on seduction, you're in a pub and you see a kind of pickup artist or somebody you think is a pickup artist, which is a very modern idea, or maybe it's a very old idea that's been revived in this kind of, I don't know what you call it, incel culture or something. I'm probably mixing things up. So what was this pickup artist doing, and did he succeed?
No, he was just like a 22-year-old guy who was at a bar by himself on like a November night in Clapham. And he was just like he was like talking to this girl and started doing a card trick, which is why I understood what was going on, because no well-adjusted person is doing card tricks in the 2010s in a pub, right? Unless you're a street magician, I guess. But yeah, and then I was sitting next to the girl's friend's table, and I heard their conversation, and then I realized what was going on, and I was like, oh wow, this is like pretty unusual to see, and also quite bleak to witness. And then they all intervened. He kind of got turfed out and then fell down the stairs on the way out. So really really miserable night for him.
Failed rake, perhaps.
Yeah, but the pickup artist stuff, good that you mentioned it, because I've forgotten this as well. The original book of that was published in the 1960s. So that came out of the sexual revolution. And again, that was kind of a lingering effect of this belief that, we can all be hyper rational agents in the sexual marketplace and like no harm, no foul. And they ended up becoming the kind of the poster boys of the kind of Me Too backlash in a bad way, in the sense that was kind of like what was seen as the modern face of that kind of older kind of creepy Weinstein 60s and 70s sleaziness.
I mean, I guess also there is a callback there to the elopers, to the let's go to Gretna Green, get her in the mood, get the carriage ready. The family can't stop you. She's only 15. She's only 16. Doesn't matter. Get her married. But it's funny because it does go back and forward, and I think you say in one of the earlier sections that it's about, are we rational people? Is it about us all rational people should be allowed to make our choices, or do we need to be policed all the time by higher authority? Which I guess is an argument that also goes back to the French Revolution as well. But I mean, putting all this stuff into the sort of intellectual story of our age or ages, what do you see next? What's the next twist, the next chapter? Or are we kind of just floating around in a generally confused state for the next few decades, do you think?
I don't know because I'm kind of a bit out of touch with what's going on at the ground level. I have to say I personally don't necessarily trust the kind of the discourse in terms of being like a certain guide to the state of play for like people in their 20s or people who are single generally. My I thought it was two interesting things. First off, apparently there's been quite a wide decline in the use of dating apps, which I find interesting. Um, that I thought was going to be the future forever. And the graphs, there is data on this, and there's a chart in the book which plots this. I thought that would last forever, and it actually seems like an increasing number of people are dropping out of that. So that's interesting. The other trend, which has been kind of more widely discussed, is that Gen Z seem to be having less sex, less social generally. I've heard, but again, I don't necessarily know this is true. They're slightly more ascetic, a bit more puritanical.
Yeah,
When it comes
less
to
drinking. I've
less
certainly seen
drinking.
data about that. Less drinking, less drug taking,
Yeah.
less sex.
Obviously, yeah, drinking drugs, like that is obviously a factor in the 60s and 70s and the kind of long legacy of that as well. And it's quite uncomfortable to talk about because we're a society that drinks quite a lot, and you really do start sounding like Oliver Cromwell if you if you call into question people's rights to, get drunk on a Saturday night. But that is a factor of it.
All right. Well, by the end of the book, were you more or less a libertarian than when you started working on it? I mean, maybe you're not a libertarian at all, but I'm guessing you are a bit.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's just I think the problem is that when things are really bad, you're probably going to need quite overreaching laws. And one of the things I would say is like an important context for all of these debates in the 19th and 18th centuries was that women had very little independence, zero economic independence, zero legal independence, uh, very little social support when things went wrong. There was not much, no medical help, very little medical help, just because the technology wasn't there. So in situations like that, where there is so little going in your favor, you understand why kind of punitive laws came into effect. And then over time, what you see is that women are now economically independent in some sectors, some ways are doing better than men in the economy, thriving at universities, strong legal support, much better medical situation, all the rest of it. And so in that environment, you would like to think that you can kind of relax some of these legal definitions. And obviously, a lot have been. There was a lot. I mean, again, not widely discussed. A lot of the laws that were on the books in the 19th century have been repealed or modified or are no longer prosecuted. So I think cautiously you can go back. You can kind of like embrace a more libertarian attitude. And I also think there's probably a natural learning process, which is that people understand after the 70s that there are real risks for sexual freedom, and only whilst there will be always legal avenues and social avenues and shaming rituals and ways of trying to organically keeping balance right, personal responsibility is always going to be part of it because it's tough out there, and whatever happens, on the front page of the New York Times or the media, and whatever the media discussion is, people will always still be vulnerable, and you see that everywhere in the UK, Europe, the US. Just for instance, from like immigration and to people smuggling. I have friends who work in that space. I mean, there's a lot of abuse and exploitation taking place, and you're going to need a solution to that, which is more than just be like, oh yeah, look after yourself. There is always going to be bad actors and bad things happening, and it has to be wrestled with in a sincere way.
Well, that's very good sense. And there's lots of good sense in the book. And we've probably made it sound a bit more theoretical than it is. It's actually full of incredibly colourful and lively stories. And I do recommend it. But also with this, really interesting new lens, I guess, to look at the development of our species and our history and our culture. Thank you for sharing that with us. I really appreciate your time.
That's
great conversation. Thanks, Clement. Bye. Well, big, clever book, big subject. Really interesting writer. I still giggled inwardly when he said, of course, now I'm in my 30s. I look back when I was a younger man in my 20s, and life seemed very different. I'm like, I'm in my mid-60s. But there you go. I think some of these themes are with us throughout our lives. And yeah, an interesting writer, where he blends ideas, makes connections. It's a really thought-provoking book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think there's a lot more to come from him. Aren't I lucky? I get to meet all these young, talented people and some older, talented people too, just because I have this little platform, which I share with you in my little corner of the internet. Thank you for letting me have that. So as you can see, I really enjoy it. Yeah, what next? Well, we went death, love, back to death, I'm afraid, but in a very different way next week. Next week, there's a big international drama. It's a British drama, but I think there's a lot of American money in it, and I think it's going to be shown all over the world. It's called A Cruel Love. It's about Ruth Ellis, the last woman to be hanged in Britain for a famous crime of passion, the case that really galvanized people to abolish the death penalty. And a case which I think most people are agreed, had it happened today, she probably wouldn't even be on trial for murder. She would probably be manslaughter. There's no doubt she did it, but as you'll see, there were very, very many extenuating circumstances, which shouldn't have led to a death sentence, even then, many people think. But it's a good story. There's a big TV drama. Lucy Boynton, who's a top actress, is playing Ruth Ellis. I haven't seen it. I've seen the trailer. It looks amazing. It's got all that kind of dark, seedy glamour of the sort of 1950s underworld, which is very much the world that Ruth Ellis lived in, and her husband, who she shot, David Blakey. And with the author of the book, Carol Ann Lee, who's written lots of really great books. I've been trying to get hold of her for ages. She's coming on the show next week, which I think will be just a day or two after the first episode goes out here in Britain. I'm not sure about Australia. I'm sure you'll be getting it. And I think in America, it might even be available now. Anyway, so Carol Ann Lee, who wrote the book that this drama is based on, is going to talk to us all about the case and what it was like for her researching and writing about it. Other things are happening. Other stories are being shot and recorded. I'm going to go back to COVID. Yeah, Matt Ridley's returning to give us an update on the origins of COVID, which has the makings of probably the biggest medical, maybe more than medical, scandal of the century. You consider what COVID did to us all. And the truth is now beginning to come out. And Matt's been a big part of finding it. So I'm really pleased that he's become part of our little gang. We've sort of mates on Twitter, and he's going to come back and talk about that. Lots of other things bubbling, which will hopefully keep you entertained. Must get Carolyn Harris back. She's going to talk about Catherine the Great. Yeah, loads of stories, a good mix. Hopefully not quite so much death. But even if there is, I'm not going to have it in the title. So at least people might click through and give the show a chance. Anyway, as ever, do appreciate your company. Thank you very much. Keep liking, keep subscribing, so that I can keep talking to these interesting people and sharing it with you all over the interwebs. Thanks, guys. Bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.